Welcome, buddy. Good to see you again.
Yeah, thanks, John. So good to talk to you, as always.
So we were just I was just explaining to you why I wanted to hook this up today. And I'll explain it again because I think it probably resonates for a lot of people. And because I want the people I send this to ultimately to understand why I'm doing so. Right. And so basically what we were just talking about is being Bitcoin bulls for as long as we've tried to impress upon the people in our lives why it's important, the value proposition, and why they might consider allocating some of their savings to this asset, right? But up until the last 18 months, it's been an opportunity, right? The earlier you adopt Bitcoin, the greater the upside opportunity is, at least during its, let's say, monetization phase, which let's say takes place over the next 10 years and has done so for the last 12 or so. But now I more and more feel like we're moving into a era and period where it's a necessity. It's not a nice to have, it's a must have. Mm-hmm. And not only is it a must have, but it's like a must almost all in have.
Right.
And so I struggle to, as much as I try, I think a lot of us struggle to impress upon those people in our lives that we are trying to communicate with the proper context for all this. Because if people are just looking at it as another hot investment, the flavor of the week or the period, it's another tech stock, it's another Amazon, then some people will just say, yeah, I'm happy with my S&P index. I don't want to take the risk. I get it. Yep. I'll allocate 5%. But if we have the broader context about what's happening now, why it's happening, and where we might likely headed in the future, it separates itself from all of those other quote unquote hot investments of the past. It really is in a league of its own. And I thought we could discuss today just why that is and what these circumstances that are currently unfolding, why they were almost inevitable and why it's important to react to them. Because just as a final piece of context, I mean, I've sent intermittent, family emails throughout the years, right? Like, guys, please look at this. This is the value prop. These are the reasons why. Countless conversations.
Right.
I've now sent like the serious email where I'm saying, look, things are deteriorating. We're not reverting back to a former norm, right? What's happening now, whether it's what's invoked is a virus, is climate change, is this political issue, that political issue, the fiat unravel is happening.
Yeah.
Right. And that means you cannot afford not to act. And I know you like your 13% a year on your S&P index, but if you map that to the increase in the money supply and monetary expansion, you're basically flat for the last several decades.
Right.
So it's no longer, I'm trying to be more forceful with this discussion because I do think it's imperative. I think if friends and family members and loved ones want to survive and thrive into the era we're moving into, they have to take substantial action now. Don't give me this, yes, I'll put 5% in. Like you have to develop a strategy, understand why you're taking it, and execute now.
Yeah.
And so, I wanted to have you on to discuss the broader context of that whole picture.
Yeah. I mean, I started making content specifically for Bitcoin. When I got into Bitcoin back in like 2015, it was mostly a way to get my money out of the banking system. So I saw a problem. I saw that the banks were insolvent. I saw the problem from 2008 wasn't fixed. I understood that I was at risk of having my entire life in one banking system or one country. And so I was trying to diversify into other banking systems. That was my problem that I saw. And I felt it was pretty urgent enough for me to act. Once I learned about so I learned about Bitcoin. It was a way to get my money out of the banking system. I had an urgent need. That was a problem that I had. There was one solution. Bitcoin met that. That was a Swiss bank account in my pocket, basically. I went into that. Once I started learning more about Bitcoin and all the problems it can solve, I've had to tell the whole world about it. I've been making content ever since. I did go down the crypto rabbit hole like a lot of other people did. The last 3 years, I've been just focused back onto Bitcoin. And really my entire content, my message is trying to find one problem in society and matching one benefit that Bitcoin has, because to kind of your point and what we're going to talk about today, it takes me back to like my sales training days. And I've never actually been a professional salesperson, but I've ran lots of companies that had sales, of course. So I've done lots of sales training and marketing. And one of the keys with sales is that what a lot of very beginner new salespeople would do is they'd go to a prospective client when you're talking about trying to convince friends, family that they should be interested in Bitcoin. What someone would do if I was going to bring my product to you is I would tell you, well, my product can do this and this and this, and my company's this and this and this, and we've done this and this and this. The founders have done this, and the client's like, whoa, I don't care about any of that. In sales, we'd call that like spilling your candy in the lobby. What you want to do, the game, this is how sales get made, is I would sit down and listen to you, John. And I would find out, what is your one need? What's the one thing that you're having a problem with? And then I would match the one benefit of my product to your one need. And that's how a sale is made, not telling you everything it can do. So Bitcoin basically permeates, it's like a string that permeates every area of life. And so there's an issue that's bothering you, John, that you're realizing is a problem. If I can show you how Bitcoin can fix that, then you're interested. The problem is that it's not a one size fits all, right? So when we're trying to tell everybody, well, some people are only concerned about their US dollar savings, but some people are worried about that they got to leave their country and they can't take their wealth with them. Some people are worried that they used to donate to this political organization, but now they're censored. Some people, right? And so everybody has these different problems. And Bitcoin can fix all of them. But it's not a one size fits all answer. And so anyway, I've spent the last 3 years trying to dig out each problem one by one and try to kind of make videos about that.
Yeah. I think part of, I guess, what's motivated my, increased attention on those friends and family members these days is that those what I'm trying to impress upon them is that, to your point, their perceived problems, like the problems that they perceive that actually do motivate action in them, are going to multiply substantially over the next 5 years, let's say.
Yeah.
So in advance of that happening and everyone running towards the exits at the same time,
yeah,
I'm trying to get them to recognize that before that happens.
Yep.
Yes, benefit from the upside, but almost more importantly, protect yourself and insulate yourself from what's to come. Because all those, and I totally agree that, Bitcoin is different things to different people. And if you're trying to escape Syria with your wealth intact versus just an inflation hedge in the US, it's vastly different.
Right.
But I think we're heading into an era where there's so much government intervention, where there's so much monetary policy abuse, where there's so much imposition by the government on people's lives, whether it's their mobility, their banking, their ability to make a living. I mean, my family's in the restaurant business. The last 18 months has been absolutely crushing for them, right? So I'm trying to impress upon them that that kind of perfect storm is coming for them. And please realize that before it's too late. Yeah. That's what I'm trying to tell them.
And I think we can tie it all together when we kind of basically, and I use this analogy, like if we had this like giant oak tree with 10,000 leaves, and every leaf on that tree is a problem. So whether you're mad about your forced lockdowns and you can't run your business, or you're worried about your mobility being restricted, or you're worried about your purchasing power going down, or the cost of homes going up, or the control that the schools have over your children, indoctrinate. I mean, any problem is a leaf on a tree. At the bottom of that tree is that root, and that root is the money printer. And so I think we could kind of blanket statement this to everybody by saying there's something in your life that isn't right. Maybe you can't quite put your finger on it, but whatever that problem is, it's caused by the money printer. And then Bitcoin fixes that. It fixes the money printer, which then in turn fixes everything.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. As we often say, fix the money, fix the world. And the problem is getting a normie, quote unquote, to see how the nature of any given money, the qualities of any given money, be it gold, fiat, Bitcoin, silver, rocks, stones, seashells, whatever, how the different qualities of the money permeate and show up and influence everything downstream of it, from the institutions to the culture to the products and services and quality and everything, right? That's a very difficult story to tell. But tell it, the story of how monies change, evolve, and influence broader macro social change, even if we don't focus in on exactly what that is, but just the fact that that's a process that happens and recurs, might be an easier story to tell. I'm not sure, but this is kind of what led me to think that you would be a good one to explain that stuff.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so we focus on a problem, and so we can look at some today, right? And I think one that I've been talking about quite a bit, and I think maybe this is kind of where we'll dive into, is just um, everybody can see that nobody could have imagined that we'd be in this state of the world today a year and a half ago. Right? Nobody could have guessed this. Like a lot of people think this is like this black swan event. Nobody could have planned for this. But I would say otherwise. I think we could see it coming. Many people have seen it coming. Many people have been reading or writing about it, reading and writing about it for decades. And this is just normal, actually. And so kind of we talked about earlier before we started recording where, and actually humans are horrible at investing because of our biases, our cognitive biases. And so we suffer from like normalcy bias or recency bias. And so that means that everything will just go back to normal. Everything will just go back to the way it is. This is, we're going to get through this and everything goes back. But that's just not true. That's like a bias that we have, and we have to be aware of that. And so I would say that, yeah, we're not in this black swan event, but I think everybody can see that there's massive problems. And at the same time, the leaders of the world are consolidating power and only doubling and tripling down on their measures that don't appear to be working. And at the same time, an equal and opposite reaction is happening, which is we're seeing people all over the world starting to push back. Videos yesterday from Paris, I mean, gas all in the streets and people are erupting. And I mean, Brazil last week had millions and millions of people, the largest protests in history. You name a country basically, and we're seeing it. And so people can witness this happening in real time. I mean, the president of the supposedly free world went on last week and came out with the most dictator type policies that anyone could have ever imagined that the leader of free world would do. And at the same time, like I think 34 states basically banded together and said, F you. Like, what is going on, right? The world's going crazy. The question is that strange or is that normal? And what's going to happen on the other side, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned people that have written about this, and I think we're all fans of the sovereign individual because, and it speaks to the power of an accurate framework, because if you can overlay the framework on what's happening, then prediction is easier, right? And I would say that the framework that those guys developed and use, the proof is in the pudding, right? They write 2 decades in advance of what's happening now and speculate and predict exactly what's happening now, right? Yeah. The fracturing of the nation state, the dispersion of the tax base, the ability for people to, extricate themselves from certain jurisdictions and hide their wealth and do all of these things. And that places extra burden on the nation state. The response from the nation state is to try to constrain ever more to reverse, to stop that trend, but it's an inevitable trend. So what you're going to get is the trend getting larger, but the efforts on behalf of the incumbent powers, the nation state structure, getting more and more authoritarian. And that's why I said at the beginning, like, yes, right now it's a virus, and maybe in the not too distant future it'll be climate change, or fill in the blank. See, it's not necessarily important what the issue is. The issue is invoked for the action that the nation state consciously or unconsciously wants to take in order to try to preserve itself. Right. And so like even the people within the machine of the structure of the nation state and politics and stuff, very, very few of them, in my opinion, would be aware of what's happening, their role in it, all of that kind of stuff. Everyone's just kind of playing to their incentives. But the punchline is that because this process is playing out as it is, some justification will be used and will be invoked in order to justify the action of constraining people more and more and more. And where that leads ultimately, especially as the source of that centralized power, the money, begins to unravel, is, and if we accept that money is the primary coordinating mechanism for human economic and social interaction, when that breaks down, something else has to rise up to fill the vacuum. And that again is authoritarian control by the centralized powers in order to try to keep things under control. And so what we have is like, these two inverse or opposite trends, which is one, more individual sovereignty, more individual freedom, more individual optionality, and the necessity for the former structure that we used, as governance during the Industrial Revolution, let's say, to try to preserve itself. And that results in greater authoritarian control, which is felt as tyranny and draconian policy to the people who are subject to it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. I think today more than ever, the governments, the leaders, the intellectuals, whatever you want to call it, they've really tried to cause confusion and uncertainty, where today words have lost their meanings, right? So like, there's no such thing as man or woman anymore, right? I mean, whatever, right? We don't know what words mean anymore. Supposedly capitalism is slavery now, I guess, instead of like a free market. So I like to kind of try to abandon the socialism, communism, fascism, capitalism, kind of lose those words and really think about just there's two opposite ends of the spectrum, which is collectivism and individualism. And I think it's easier if we kind of understand it like that. And if we go back through the beginning of time, it's always a battle between those two. And the battle rages on, and that's exactly what we're seeing today. You mentioned The Sovereign Individual, which is an amazing book, and I highly recommend everyone to read. As a matter of fact, I keep a copy nearby all the time because I reference it quite a bit. Another book that I've been reading again, and I've been tweeting about, I tweeted about yesterday, is The Anatomy of the State by Rothbard. And this is a very difficult book to get through. And I'm a reader. The Anatomy of State is like a booklet that you could like read in like a sitting. And I recommend everyone to read that. But it talks about what is the state, who is the state, what keeps the state, what's the goal of the state, right? How the state stays in power. So while I like this book, and let's dig into that, it was written in 1997, and it was like prophetic to tell like what. I think it's instructional for what the future holds. I really like 1984, which was written in the 40s, which basically predicted all this to happen. And I think also The Road to Serfdom by Hayek is also another really good book to understand how we got here. And then The Sovereign Individual is great to kind of tell us what the future holds if we use those two. But if you look at 1984, which is, like I said, written in the 40s, or if you look at Anatomy of the State by Rothbard, which is written, I think, in the 70s, they both explain that in order for the state to maintain power, kind of to your point, right? Once they get the power, they want to maintain power. How do they maintain power? And so both of them spelled that out. I tweeted Rothbard's from the book on Anatomy of the State yesterday, and it says that in order for the state to maintain power, they use intellectuals, and they use intellectuals to push ideology that the state is good. The state is all-knowing, and they use experts and science. It literally says that. So this wasn't anything new. They've been writing about this for decades, 30, 40 years, that they would use science, and that both in 84, but also in Anatomy of the State, they talk about how, people are going to try to push people to sacrifice freedom for safety. And it depends on where that hierarchy is. And how if freedom becomes the number one driving principle, then everything else has to fall behind that, unfortunately. But no progress was ever made being free. Of course, the free world, the new world, would have never been found if people were trying to be safe. Space would have never been conquered if people were trying to be safe. And so safe doesn't get us anywhere, but pretty interesting. But at the same time, if you read those books, as much as they predicted where we're at, I think they also help us to figure out where we're going.
Where is that?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, a lot of it is written in this book, right? But I think what we can see is that, like, if we go back to the beginning of time, as I said earlier, we have this individualism and collectivism, and they basically try to push against each other, and it flip-flops. So we see oppression, revolution, freedom, oppression, revolution, freedom, oppression, and it just basically continues on forever. And I think the reason why is because, humans. I said on that podcast the other day that humans are the problem. Somebody took offense to that, and that's not what I mean. I mean, man are good. I believe that to a fault. I believe that everybody's good, and that's caused problems for me in the past. But I don't mean that humans are the problem. But I mean that humans are always, there's a group of people, whether that's the homeowners association or the parent teacher association or local government or the president. There's a group of people that just want to control others. And they just want to tell people what to do. And so once they've been given a little bit of power, that power grows, right? And then they try to maintain that power, which is back to that anatomy of the state. And eventually they've gotten so much power that the people can't take it anymore, and they revolt. And then there's freedom. And so that cycle just kind of goes on and on and on. And what's interesting is as is that it's kind of like if we were bowling and we put bumpers up and the balls just binging off each side, where it's like this, or there's a book actually titled The Pendulum, and it talks about this, the pendulum just swinging back and forth from individualism to collectivism, individualism and collectivism. And so it gets so bad that people push back, and then the pendulum swings, and it gets so bad the other way that it pushes back and forth. And so just based off of that alone, we can dig into a bunch of other indicators, but just based off of that alone, I think it's pretty evident to see that we're like at least almost at or at peak centralization, peak globalization, peak collectivism. We hear it all over the place, right? We're all in this together. We are all in this together. Now the thing is, we will all build back together. And so it's this collectivist message that's pushing, and we can see that the power continues to get consolidated. I tweeted this morning, Biden put out some ridiculous new mandate that 50% of cars on the road have to be EV by 2030. We're at 2% today. So we should all own unicorns that poop Skittles too, I guess. I don't see how either one are going to be realistic. But anyway, and oh, by the way, in order to incentivize that, if you buy an EV, well, they're trying to sneak through this $3.5 trillion bill. The $1 trillion bill. If you buy an EV, you get a $12,500 credit. But only if you buy an EV from companies that have unionized labor. If you buy from Tesla or Toyota or Honda that are built in America, but they don't use unionized labor, you don't get the credit. So they're just pushing people to become the centralization that globalism is continuing to get more and more and more centralized, that power. We can see it all over. I could sit here and rack off examples all day. So I think we're at peak globalization, but as we kind of started earlier, but we're seeing the world erupt. Millions of people all over the world are pushing back. And so we can see that we're at peak globalization. And so history tells us the pendulum swings back the other way to individualism.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of framing it. And you know, individualism, as a result of being in an environment like that, has become a dirty word. You know, for a lot of people, that's a criticism. People will say, you know, you're too individualistic, and people don't realize that that's all there is. Yes, as like there's emergent order from all of us taking individual decisions, like you get emergent outcomes, of course, but there is no collective action. Right? Like there's people acting, and we as a result of being in this era, you know, and I'm from Canada, and it's the same everywhere really, but in Canada, it's particularly pronounced that whenever there's a problem of any kind, you know, like some issue in society, some need is not being met, I think most of us would say the most effective way for that need to be met is for that demand to be signaled to the market, and for someone in the market to capitalize on that demand and provide the best possible solution. But in the world today, it's the government apparatus is supposed to be the one to fix all problems. If there's an issue, you go to them. And I can't blame those people entirely, because they have the magic money printer, which over time centralizes power, because that permits them the ability to take action whenever they need to, via the siphoning off of resources from the productive market, of course. But like the punchline is you would expect any entity with that level of extreme power to ultimately become a type of godlike figure in the society, because they basically have unlimited ability to do things. And so, of course, people don't realize the danger and the destruction of always going to that governing apparatus to fix every little problem. People, unfortunately, aren't that sophisticated or educated in these matters, but it's certainly not a surprise that they would do that. And, you know, so as you were saying,
it is kind of a surprise though, because I think if you actually had, you know, any critical thinking and you actually did a little bit of historical research, I don't know if you could point to many things that the government has actually fixed. Everything that has been created by individuals. You know, in the early days of the United States, all the roads and railroads, that was all built by private businesses, private individuals. The healthcare system, all the innovation has all come from private individuals. The government goes and co-ops it, and they typically make it worse. So I don't know if I could point to a lot of things that the government has actually made better.
Well, of course, I agree with you, but the problem
So
is in today's world, there is such an oversimplification of thinking. And that fact alone is reason enough not to trust any of the narratives that are attempting to be imposed on you. Like, forget all the motivations, all the incentives, all the competing interests. The fact that we live in a world today where the thinking is so overly simplistic and narrow means I do not trust anyone creating a narrative for me. I will take in the information. I will put it through my filter. I will make the best decision for me. And that statement in itself is like almost radical today, right? Because look at where we're at. Like we encounter a global problem, right? In the Rona, however much of a problem that really is, maybe we'll never, that really is, maybe we'll never know. But it's like there wasn't even discussion about solution. It's like narrow definition and probably over amplification of a problem, narrowly defined solution, cookie cutter approach for everybody, and that is one manifestation of that overly simplistic thinking, but it applies to so many different areas of our lives, which is why I think most of us would characterize a lot of society as being, kind of asleep in some capacity, not having the resources to think about things in a more holistic or detailed or truthful way.
Well, I think you can see it, and I not to dig into politics, and again, I don't like using labels, but if we were looking at, individualism, collectivism, we can see this thinking, and I don't know if you want to call it the left and the right as well, but like, you obviously are very into your health, as am I. I believe that I'm responsible for my health. I work hard at my health. But you might see other people on the other side that, I believe that all change starts with me. I need to become more educated. I need to make my body stronger. I need to build my income and my savings higher. I need to do more philanthropy and go out and do more good in the world. I need to go do those things. Whereas we see people on the other side say, John, you need to. John, you need to pay reparations to other people. John, you need to give your money to the government so they can do good. John, you need to like give up your health right? So like you see the other side is like, it's for you. You need to do all these things. Whereas I think on the other side, the individual side is like, I need to do these things. I create the change in the world by making me better, making my family better, making my friends better, et cetera. So it's just a different approach. But to your point, I mean, there is no collective state. It's only made up of individuals. And so, we've been, and it's, I guess, I hate to say it's not people's fault, but I guess everyone's been so brainwashed where, John, it's not your fault. It's not your fault that you can't lose weight. It's not your fault that you can't get money. It's not your fault that you don't have a good job. It's not your fault, but it is. It is your fault. Jordan Peterson likes to say, like, hey, it's like a game of poker. Like you get the hand that you were dealt, but you just play it the best that you can. The past is the past, but the future is up to you. And I think more people need to hear that message.
Yeah, I totally agree. The only caveat I would say is that I think the proper perspective to have is that everything is your fault. You're responsible for everything, right? And there are some great literary works and people throughout the ages that have suffered massively under, insane conditions, right? Like Viktor Frankl, who still says, like, no matter what your condition, like your freedom is your ability to choose in any given moment, right? Like who you are, how you feel, how you will act. And I agree with all that. But it is also the case that most people alive in the world today have been subject to a system that makes it unnecessarily unfair for them, right? So like I have sympathy. And again, that's why I try to talk about Bitcoin and spread the word about Bitcoin, because I think that's the thing that evens the playing field. So that still everyone's going to start on, different levels. You're going to be 6'5" and jacked. You're going to be 4 foot and, pudgy and all that kind of stuff. Like everyone's going to be different, but at least we're all on the same playing field. Right. And then we can let our skills and our work ethic and our insight and our talent and all that kind of stuff emerge and help guide us in whatever direction we want to go. But we've been placed under this system of planned deprivation effectively and planned unfairness, because that deprivation is caused by a lot of the wealth siphoning up to what is effectively a small group of people. And you don't have to invoke any sort of conspiracy for this. However the system came to be, whether there was intent, whether they knew what would result, whatever, the fact of the matter is that's what the system does, And so you mentioned a few minutes ago that we have these competing factors. Like there's this faction of people that are uber collectivist minded, and then there's these people that are, basically protesting a lot of these collectivist policies and these impositions. Now, maybe not all of them are quite as clearly delineated as that, but what do you think it is that's causing, and you said we may be at the kind of the apex of this, where the pendulum has swung to the collectivist side, and maybe it'll begin now swinging back to the individual side, as a result of technologies like Bitcoin and information technology and, the whole sovereign individual thesis. What do you think is causing that, let's say, awakening in people so that they're pushing back against the collectivist policies?
Yeah. So, when we're looking at, finance, economics, macro, things like that, you're looking for like indicators. So indicators would be like little telltale signs. If I was driving down the road, you give me directions like, hey, turn right at the mailbox and turn left at the end of the fence, right? Like those are indicators that we see that help us know where we're going. When you look at indicators, you never want to look at just one indicator. You need multiple indicators. And I think there's three that we need to be looking at. And I'm calling these three revolutionary cycles. And what's interesting is there's three different revolutionary cycles from three different areas that run on three different timeframes, but they all seem to be converging right now at the exact same time. And so the first one is that we can see, just as we're talking about, right, that the world is like cracking apart. This is like what I call a political, social, or cultural cycle. This is like us, the people, the state versus the people, kind of how we interact, the political, social, cultural. And that works on different timeframes. Then we have the technological revolutions. I'm not talking about technologies like a new iPhone or the internet. I'm talking about a technological revolution that changes the face of humanity. That happens on a 50-year time frame. And then we have financial revolutions. And those happen on 80-year time frames. And so there's three different revolutions: financial, technological, and politically. And they work on different time frames, and we can talk through each one. But the fact is they're all converging right now, which is why it's like amplifying the message. It's amplifying the effects, and it's amplifying what people are seeing and feeling in real time. Most people just don't know how to put their finger on it. They can all feel it. They can all see it. They know it, but they're not sure what it is. And it's because it's everywhere. It's everything all happening at once. If that makes sense.
Yeah, well, it makes total sense. And you said we can dig into each one, and I think we should, because it would be good to get some details on it.
So we've already been talking about the political, social, cultural side. And so socially, culturally, individualism, collectivism, politically, governments, people, so that's kind of what that's entailing. And basically, as I kind of already laid out, like history goes from this, pendulum swinging of oppression to freedom. And really there's a bunch of different cycles, but there's two that I like to pick up on. And so there's one that runs in like every 84 years. It's a 84 year, it's a political, populist uprising or regime change. So about every 84 years, you see this populist uprising, which is what we see today, populism uprising, and regime change, systems change. So 84 years ago was Hitler, Mussolini, and in the United States was the FDR's New Deal, which effectively turned the United States from kind of a capitalist society to a socialist society. So that was regime change. 84 years before that was Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, which led to the European Spring, which is the largest revolution that Europe has ever seen. So those are every 84 years we see those. And what's interesting is 84 times 3 equals 252. So about every 250 years, we see a revolution cycle. And so that's what we're talking about, this revolution. And so 250 years ago was the American Revolution, the French Revolution. And 250 years before that was the Protestant Reformation. And so each one of those, so every 250 years, we see this. And what each one signifies, really, if you dig in and look at it, is that they're rejecting centralization to move to decentralization. So it's obvious in the American Revolution, they're rejecting the centralization of the monarchy. They didn't want to be controlled by one, by a king, by a crown, especially in another country. And then 250 years before, and then they pushed back against that, the centralization. And what did they create? They created a republic, which was a decentralized government. So each state being independent, working together, individuals working together collectively for the benefit of the state. So they created this kind of first independent or decentralized government. So they pushed away from centralization, created decentralization. The 250 years before that, the Protestant Reformation was a similar thing. So at the time, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, but trying to create these intellectuals at the time. Kings used to be considered God or deity, and then kings worked with churches to create that position of power. And so at the time, basically the king and the church worked together, and the only way to get to God was through the church. People didn't have access to the Bibles. They couldn't read the Bible for themselves. And so centrally, if I wanted salvation, there was one central path that I had to go down. 70 years earlier, the printing press had been created. And so everyone had gotten Bibles and they started reading for themselves. And they realized, I don't need this central path. We can go decentralized. We can all have our own path. We can all go individually to God. And it broke that grip of centralization and created decentralization. And so that shows us that every 250 years, peak globalization, peak centralization, rejects for decentralization. And so, now today we're at that peak, right? We're seeing this peak centralization, peak globalization. We're also seeing that the world is rejecting it at the same time. And so history tells us that it rejects globalism and we move to a decentralized system.
Why do you think those numbers of years are what's at play in these respective cycles?
So I think there's a couple other books that I've read that so obviously people are probably familiar with generational theory, which is also was what was talked about in the Fourth Turning. And they talk about four 20-year periods, 4 different generations. And at this point, everybody's heard the saying of, hard times bring great men and great men bring great times bring weak men bring bad times. And then it repeats. The reason why that's important is because, like I said, like if we're bowling and we have bumpers up, it just moves from one to the other. And so it's easy to see how that framework could work. Hard times create strong men. People have to, when times are tough and you can't live and you can't feed your family or war's happening, like someone's going to have to rise up. And then those people make great times. And we can see this just in the United States, for pretty evident. My dad grew up on a farm in Iowa. My grandfather was an immigrant to the country from Holland, and he worked his ass off building the farm, and he made my dad work his ass off on a farm. When my dad grew up, he would literally be loaned out to the neighbors to help them with their harvest. That's how they did it back then. My dad then went on, college educated, went into the military, became an entrepreneur. And I work hard, but I had way better times that my dad created for me. I work hard, but not anywhere near as hard. And now I've reached a level of affluence and my kids don't have any of that. Right. And so you can see just in those generations from my grandfather, my father, me, and now my kids. And I've created great times. And unfortunately, those great times, they just create weak men. So there's kind of that generational theory. And then there's another book I mentioned earlier called The Pendulum, and it documents these 80-year cycles. Again, another 80-year cycle, 80, 84. It's kind of like there's 4 seasons in the, summer, spring, winter, fall. On the calendar, it has an exact date that it happens, but it doesn't mean that the weather changes right there. It's kind of plus or minus, so 80, 84 years. But the pendulum basically documents thousands of years of this pendulum swinging back and forth. And again, why does it happen, to your question? People are so oppressed that they just reject and they go back the other way. If you look at any financial chart, like a stock chart, you'll see there's a mean, and the price, even like Bitcoin, continues to go up and down over that, but it's always trying to revert back to that mean. But the further it gets stretched to one side, it typically goes further to the other side. So that's why I'd say it's generational theory. It's reactionary. I guess is probably the best answer. It's reactionary.
Yeah. I've been reading a book by Eric Neumann, The Origins and History of Consciousness. He's deceased now, I believe, but he was a student of Jung's. I think the book was written in the 60s. And it talks a lot about, consciousness, right? And the archetypes that animate consciousness and the development and evolution of consciousness over time. And, it seems when we talk about these cycles, like, the hard times instill humility in people, right? And, because things are super hard and you don't get to think about so much like all the different self-serving options that are available to you, right? What you're trying to figure out is self-preservation and preservation of your loved ones. And that's a very, I think, humbling perspective to be put in. And then if you fast forward to the good times that create the weak men or weak people, these are times where humility isn't necessary. Options are available. Abundance is everywhere. And I would assume that those two states, those two circumstances manifest very different aspects of our consciousness, right? Humility kind of grounds you in like kind of a conservative mind in what's real, being careful with things, respecting how fragile life and systems and all of that kind of stuff is, right? Whereas, and that obviously has an impact on your consciousness and your perception of yourself and your ambition and your emotional stability. And then contrast that with the opposite, those times of exuberance and footloose and fancy free, you don't have to worry about stuff as much and you don't have to be as conservative. Well, that obviously affects your consciousness differently and draws out different elements and archetypes within you, and so perhaps it's for that reason that whatever time scale and whatever cycle we're looking at, it's the nature of our consciousness is what causes these cycles to continue to recur over time, because our consciousness generates one circumstance and environment and also reacts to it, right? So we generate it, but then we're influenced by it. And when we find ourselves in one that's influencing us in a very different way, let's say, then we act differently. And I wonder if it's possible to even escape that. I know we'll probably discuss how Bitcoin changes the game and the cycles a little bit, but I wonder if it's forever just kind of our circumstance of the consciousness that we have.
Well, it is that consciousness, but it's the environment that maybe creates the consciousness. So there's 8 stages of like an empire. And so it starts with the outburst. So the outburst is the revolution. The outburst is the new creation. That's the spring, right? The winter killed off the bad. Now we have the spring, the outburst. And then it goes into the conquest. That's when things start stabilizing, things start getting set up. Then you go into the commerce. So now people are setting up their businesses. Everyone's freely trading. Everything's going good. The 4th stage then goes to affluence, which is that good times now. So now things are going great. Everybody's benefited from the free markets. Everybody's feeling great. Everyone's making a lot of money. People are feeling good. Then we move into the next stage, which is the age of intellect. So you see, it's the stage that created the environment that created that consciousness. So the environment of affluence, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it took away the need for us to like worry about what we're going to eat every day. We have massive influence. And so then what happens next? Well, we move to intellect, right? Now people can go just talk about philosophy and people can study because they don't have those needs anymore. There's so much affluence. The next stage after intellect, the 7th stage, 6th stage is decadence. After intellect becomes decadence. So again, that state, the environment causes that consciousness, and maybe where we go to decadence. And so now people are buying $500 million yachts, and they're buying $68 million JPEGs, and they're spending $18,000 to buy invisible art. And that's decadence, right? You see people on TikTok or whatever talking about their watch and their shoes and their car and all those things, obviously the rappers and whatnot. The 7th stage after decadence goes to the decline. That's when things start falling apart, right? And if you think about back to the hierarchy of needs, right? Like now, and this is so evident in the United States. If you travel, and as I know you do, we hung out in El Salvador together. I traveled through Mexico and Central America quite a bit. You don't see it there because those people are struggling so hard. But in the United States or in Canada, where you're from, because of the affluence, intellect, decadence, it goes to decline, which is that all of our needs are taken care of. So now I'm going to make a big fit over a pronoun you may or may not call me. You think anybody in El Salvador or Mexico cares about a freaking pronoun? Like, like, you know what I mean? And so like we're creating all these problems out of nothing, nothing. That's the decline. It also, it's not in this chart, but it also leads to the seventh stage is also considered dependence. So the decline leads to dependence, which is of course UBI, right? STIMI, things like that. And then the final stage, the dependence turns into bondage. And that's the eighth stage, the collapse. And so I don't know, I guess, and you can back to how you left it to me, that consciousness. So, I mean, doesn't it seem like it's kind of that environment that maybe leads to that? And then it's easy to see because it's reactionary, how that one environment now needs to have the next environment.
Yeah, totally. And, obviously it's a constant feedback loop between the two, right? Like it's not just that one causes the other exclusively, it's feeding back between the two. But, I think that one of the maybe psychological components that characterize the decadence phase is that people forget or don't realize or aren't informed of what actually led to the good times.
Yeah.
Right. So like whether it be principles, whether it be laws, whether it be philosophies, like all the different things that, to maybe use a stereotype, but like your grandfather, the things that he held in his mind that helped him build the farm, provide for the family, go through the tough times to build all that. In the decadence phase, it's almost like people assume all that happens by default, all that happens automatically, and that there's no respect or recognition for the very things that provide the decadence, and that's why it goes away.
It's 100% right. So I like to say that we have like natural laws, right? So of course you agree, but like gravity, for example, right? That's a natural law. Now, with enough money and enough technology, I could defy gravity temporarily, but I'm always going to be beholden to that law. Another law is the law of sowing and reaping. I must sow before I reap, right? I must produce before I consume. The problem is, if we just go back to the 4 stages of generational theory, the hard times, the great men brought great times. They built up this storehold of wealth, to your point, the grandfather, right? And then we have today we have a second generation of people who have never worked, they've never produced, they've never sowed. But to what you just said, they think they don't tie the sowing to the reaping, which is a natural law. That's gravity. They were able to just be flying. They didn't realize that there was gravity. And so they don't realize that you have to produce before you consume. The problem is those people are the ones in academia and politics. So those people that live in this fairy tale world that don't understand how that you must actually sow before you reap are the ones making the policies today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, it kind of makes sense that they would gravitate towards those industries that have that characteristic where that you can reap before you sow, right? That's what, politics and fiat academia is. It's the magic money printer bestowing value on these institutions and on these jobs where the market would not have done so, right? So it's like this unnatural valuing of certain deeds, and the people that don't ascribe to the sow before you reap mentality, of course they gravitate towards that more, know. And one of the go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead if you want.
Well, I was just going to say, one of the things that frustrates me so much about politics everywhere, but again, I'm from Canada, and so I pay a more close attention to what's going on there, is you get all these politicians, virtue signaling about, pick an issue. And there's so little humility, there's so little recognition of, again, like what actually, and I'm no proponent. I have been critical of modern, society for a while, right? Like even before 18 months ago, I mean, I was critical about how politics worked, how the money system worked, all this kind of stuff. But even as critical as I was, like, you have to also appreciate the things that allowed us to get to our place where we're at, as imperfect as it is. And you just get this sense from all these people that none of the things, like a complete lack of recognition of what manifested that circumstance.
Yeah.
So for example, like freedom of speech, right? This is a sacrosanct principle of culture so that we can contend with the best information and the most opinions and sift through them all and have them out in discourse so that we have a chance at coming to a collective conclusion when that, or a collective or a truth when it's necessary to do so. And we have in today's society not only the lack of recognition, but the active destruction of all those principles that actually were the fundamental characteristics that allowed a relatively, compared to history, free society to flourish. And so you have all these people that claim, virtuous inclusion for the greater good, all this kind of stuff, who are the ones that are actually tearing down the very things that provide the level of freedom that we have in free societies today. And this is part of the reason, to bring it way back to the point of this discussion in my, warnings to loved ones, is like, this is why I'm so concerned, because it doesn't all just happen because, like we're as you say, because we're in this decadent time in the modern world, or at least many of us, and I don't want to discount the big and growing portion of the population that are actually suffering tremendously, right? Like that, they often get ignored when people say like, oh, aren't times so great right now? It's like, well, they're good and could be better for many of us.
They're not in the empire.
A lot of people, like all those people in San Francisco and all the homeless people throughout everywhere and all the people on food stamps, like they ain't sitting around saying like, oh, aren't things so great? So we have to remember those people when we have these conversations. But like people, when we do away with the things that got us to where we were, to the point where we can almost ignore those very things, or at least we're not immediately punished for doing so, that's what gives me the greatest concern, right? And that's what kind of makes me so convicted about or so confident about how this is going to unravel.
Yeah.
If we do away with, the money, or let's say the money has been degrading for the last 50 years and it's reaching its kind of death throes sort of moment, and we do away with the kind of ideas or principles that help to erect the freest societies that we've ever had, even those two things alone, we're headed to a very bad place if we don't adjust or react or do something about that. Hence my, my concern and how I try to communicate with family members.
Yeah. And I think, I know this video is meant to go try to kind of encourage or persuade those people who don't really get it. I guess the piece that I would leave this section with would be that when you understand that, just like natural law of sowing and reaping, the systems that we have today won't work. They don't work. We must sow before we reap. That's just the only way. It's a natural law. And so we've been able to suspend that temporarily with enough money and technology like gravity. But we're always going to be beholden to that law. And so for me, because I'm not super happy with the way things are, well, I hate to say that. Look, if we could just freeze in time right now, maybe where we were last year, if we go back like a year and just freeze it, like maybe I could just be okay with that. The problem is I understand where this is heading, right? But it's crumbling. It won't work. It's falling apart. It won't work because it ignores that natural law. The irony and kind of what you were saying is supposedly right now, everything's trust the science, trust the scientists. Well, science would observe, right? So science, first of all, people get this misunderstood. Science is not a fact. Science is not a fact. Science is an observation and an opinion about the observation. That's what science is. And the opinions are made by man, and that's different people could have different opinions of the same observation, and it's constantly evolving. So first of all, anyone that thinks it's fact is wrong. But anyway, what to my point, it would be observing the situation. What led up to this event? That's science. We're supposed to trust the science. But to your point, we've completely ignored all the things that have been good that have led to this event. So typically you'd go, well, this was a bad outcome, like 200 million people died of communism. That's bad. What led to that? Okay, it was these steps. The greatest civilization on earth that brought more people out of poverty. What led to that? And you would typically think they would look to that, trust the science, but of course they've ignored that.
Yeah, well, spot on, right? It's complete bullshit, and you get people today, putting various photos on social media and hashtags and all this stuff, science, trust science and stuff. It's like they're out of their fucking minds. They're not they're trusting government and pharmaceutical companies. They ain't fucking trusting science, right?
Yeah.
You can't claim to be trusting science when you're marginalizing or censoring half the information that's attempting to come out, right? As you say, science is about observation. Let's take in all the data we can. Let's sift through it. Let's analyze it. Let's discuss it. Let's debate it. Let's determine the validity of it, and then let's discuss options and solutions.
People say the science is settled.
Today.
Have you heard that? The science is settled. It's like, no, it's never settled.
Science is a process. Yeah, exactly. But again, that's just another example of how insane things have become, right? Yeah. And all this virtue signaling and all this misuse of terms, go back to Orwell and stuff, like how words are being redefined and meaning is being adjusted, and it's madness, really. But back to the point about centralization and decentralization, the collective and the individual. Is this, in your opinion, do you think this is just how human beings and the societies that flourish around them evolve? So I'll put a bit more detail on that question. That book I referenced earlier, his basic thesis is that the evolution of consciousness seems to be moving toward greater individuation, right? So like greater identification with the individual ego. Now, that's not to say egotistical behavior. It's just that the individual person is more and more identified with the self than with the collective. Very simple analogy would be, let's say, millions of years ago, we ran around as packs of apes, right? And, there was very little differentiation between the behavior of the individual members of that group. Whereas as consciousness evolved and as people have, let's say, more unique individuated thoughts, of course, they become more individuated, unique people. And that kind of process plays out, and it's still playing out, right? It's not finished. But power and wealth and competence and those sorts of things, to my mind, seem to always centralize, right? If I'm stronger, faster, more talented, wealthier than you, then I have the ability to garner more resources, compete better against you effectively, and therefore power and wealth and all those things concentrate. But there comes a point in time where that concentration ends up being detrimental to the system which fostered it, let's say, and all the different players in that system. And so it's almost like the competition and the concentration is what pushes things forward for a time, but then there's a realization or a fragility or a destabilization that results from the disparity, let's say, between the different actors being, being too great, that it has to dissolve back into something more distributed before it can again push forward and to become more individuated, and then back in, and I guess the archetypal or symbolic representation of this would be like the ego dissolving into the Ouroboros, right? Which is, let's just say, pure potential, and then coming back into individuated form with more information from that state so that they can kind of keep evolving on that process. So, and this may be a weird analogy, but if you've ever watched like these nature documentaries where the time lapse of forests growing, or it might be a fungus on a tree, or it might just be a tree itself, like it's never just like whoop, like straight up or straight growth, right? It's always like a pulsating growth, right? There's a push toward growth, and then there's
it's summer, spring, winter, fall.
Right, exactly. There's a contraction, there's a consolidation, but not back to the level at which it started, like ahead of that to some degree. And then it pushes forward again, and then it contracts and it pushes forward again. So is this cycle, or these cycles that you've been articulating, which seem to almost all be related to individual versus collective. Is this inevitable? Is this how we move forward? Like we go towards collective individual concentration, and then we dissolve back into the collective for a time, and then we go back, more into individual. Like, is that why?
So I think we can move into the next technological revolution that's converging, and that helps answer more questions. But before we do, I'll just say this. So, and you understand philosophy better than I do, but we'll talk about this. So I'll tell this to the audience, not to you. But without joy or without pain, there's no joy. Right? There's no such thing as like steady growth. You have to have cycles. You have to have, to your point, nature has to grow and then it has to pull back. We have to have recessions. We have to have revolutions. My muscle grows by tearing it down, right? We grow under stress. It's the only way. So that's another reason why these academia and intellectuals have it wrong today. They think everything can just be okay and just grow forever, and there can be no recessions and nobody can be unhappy. And that's just not true. We have to be unhappy sometimes. Otherwise we won't know what joy is, right? And so
creative destruction is,
creative destruction.
Right? Yeah.
So to kind of your earlier point, which is some people are smarter and they'll collect more wealth, and then eventually that could be the detriment to the rest of the people. I would say, that's one way of thinking. Obviously that's what that's what communists think. That's what they think, that capitalism can only go so far. And then capitalism caps out because of the monopolies that form. Then you need to go through socialism, which socialism then tears it down. And then only then can communism emerge, like this butterfly coming from a cocoon. I don't believe that. And the reason why I don't believe that is because things progress. Progression is not linear. Progression is exponential. So things change very quickly. Under a true free market system, things evolve and change so fast that the guy who was smart before and collected all the wealth won't be smart the next time. Somebody else will be. Mm-hmm. Only through using government regulations and coercion are they able to stem the tide of creative destruction enough where they can maintain their monopoly. But under a free system, it constantly changes. And then when we move into this next cycle, which is the technological revolutions, that's what changes it. So I said earlier, like things are reactionary, right? So it makes sense that solutions come to problems. I see a problem, I create a solution. Now today with the money printer, we have a bunch of money that's chasing, trying to go solve things that don't need to be solved. But typically, back to this individualism thing, individuals would have a problem and they'd come up with a solution. And so solutions come to problems. And what happens is the political, social, cultural problems that we have find technological solutions. That's technological revolution. And then technological revolutions drive financial cycles. So that's how all three work together. Like, the last technological revolution we had, 1971, was the age of the microprocessor. Actually, let me just walk you back through them. So there's been 5 in the last 250 years. They happen on a 50-year cycle. So I was going to reference Marx earlier. Marx was mad because he was born in the time of the Industrial Revolution. He was born to a wealthy, affluent family that were lawyers, attorneys. He didn't want to become an attorney. He wanted to be a philosopher. And he was mad at the world that he couldn't survive just writing poetry and philosophy. That's what he wanted to do. And he was mad. And it was, so all his writing about, the Communist Manifesto was mad at the capitalists, because he didn't want to conform to that world. He wanted to write philosophy. But it was also during the time of the Industrial Revolution. So that was the first technological revolution that we had. It changed humanity. All of humanity, people farmed, and there was like a cottage industry, but that brought people into factories and cities, changed humanity forever. Approximately 50 years later, we had steam engines and steel. So all of humanity, we had manpower and horsepower. Now we had steam engines, changed everything. And we had steel. I mean, steel's changed everything. We can go from 2-story brick buildings to skyscrapers and bridges. The next one, we had electricity, changed humanity, right? Like at the time, and this is interesting, we'll get back to this, but at the time, it was a way to have like an electric light bulb. I don't need that. I got a candle. Right? I don't need an electric light bulb. I have candle. Yeah, but look what we're doing today because of electricity, right? Then fast forward 1908, we had the age of oil and the automobile and mass production. So all of humanity, people walked or rode horses forever. That's it. And now we had cars, trucks. We could transport things. And then 1971, the microprocessor, which led to personal computers, which led to mobile phones, which led to the internet and the information age. 1971 plus 50 years is 2021 right now. And there's another technological revolution that's starting right now that will change humanity. Technological revolutions aren't new technologies. New technologies like the iPhone or like Airbnb, they extend an economy. Those micro improvements continue to make that economy new. The technological revolution is the creative destruction you referenced earlier, which completely gets rid of the old way, creates a new way that's so powerful that creates entire new markets off of it. You could obviously see that the automobile created all types of markets, not just automobile manufacturers, but service stations and roads and construction companies and service providers and parts suppliers. I mean, right? Also the same with the computer and the internet. It created entire economies. And now we have another technology. What's interesting about this technological revolution, which you already know what it is, but I won't spoil it for the listeners yet, is this new technology again. Solutions come to problems, right? So when we look at the political, social, cultural problems that we have, well, we already highlighted that it starts with the money printer. So we have a problem where one group of people are able to create as much money for themselves as they want and give it to all their friends and cronies. That's a big problem. It creates a ripple through every problem in the society. So that's a problem. Another problem is censorship. Not just censorship in the fact that you and I are dancing around our words right now because this might get banned, which I know I've heard you censor yourself, and I have too. Not just that, but even in the ability to hold our wealth. So the government can create more money and steal our wealth through inflation. That's a problem. I think a couple of weeks ago, we saw PayPal and the Anti-Defamation League partnered up. Anti-Defamation League will now tell PayPal everybody that they think is saying bad things online, mean things, and PayPal will censor their financial transactions, and they will share them with all the other financial companies. So not only do they censor my money by stealing it away through inflation, they also censor what I can do with it. I couldn't send it to you if they didn't like you. I couldn't receive money if they didn't like me, et cetera. So that's a problem. Another big problem. And this is more evident today than we've ever seen before. You mentioned your family's in the restaurant business. We used to be ruled by law. The Constitution was a rule of law that was meant to be easy to understand. So everybody could understand what that law is. And then we could all set our life based off that law. I could plan my life based off the law. You could plan your life based off that law. Hayek talks about this on The Road to Serfdom. He's got a whole chapter devoted to this. It's a must read. But basically, we should be able to plan our lives based off that. But today, we're ruled by men who arbitrarily change the laws, like your family. You can't eat inside your restaurant anymore. So they spend all this money and all this time to set up outside. Now you can't eat outside anymore. But if you go inside and put plexiglass up, you can do 30%. So I reconfigure the whole restaurant. I spend all this money on plexiglass. Now you can go to 50%. It's like, I can't work like that. I can't have this. So this ruled by men is a problem. So what do we need? We need immutable law that can't be changed, right? So when you start looking at those things, those are the problems that we have. The solution needs to solve those. So we need a decentralized solution that nobody can control, that has immutable law, not governance like some other projects have, but immutable law. We need a fixed supply instead of this unlimited money printer. And so the technological revolution that we have today is just that: decentralized technology that's censorship resistant, that can't be seized, stolen, can't be manipulated. And it has immutable law, not governance on it. And so we have that today. And obviously that's cryptocurrencies, right? We're talking about that generally. Of course, there's, I don't know, today I've lost track, 8,000, 9,000, 12,000 cryptocurrencies. But when you understand that problems come to solutions, I'm sorry, solutions come to problems, if you understand what the problems are, which I've just laid out, and then you look at the 8 to 12,000 cryptocurrencies that are out there and go, well, which ones of those solve those problems? Because those are the big problems. Which one solve it? Then you just figure that there's only one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And it's such an interesting point. It bears repeating the benefit of immutable law, right? The benefit of knowing the rules of the game, the benefit of knowing the terrain that in which you're acting. As a perfect example is like we were saying with the laws of society and the principles and the ideas that help to erect a society. It is those things that people can rely on as being, okay, if I abide by these rules, right? And if I will be held to, these rules, then I know the parameters in which I can act. I can plan for acting within those parameters. I can expect and predict other people to act within those parameters. Planning is easier, execution is easier, everything, right? And, been reading a lot about religion lately. And I mean, I think some people characterize religion as the attempt to discern or discover what the immutable laws of human experience or the reality, let's say, that humans experience, right? So not necessarily the world of matter and measurement, but what are the immutable laws of human experience? And I think part of the religious endeavor is to tease those out to inform, again, how we act in the world, right? So whether it's in the religious domain, whether it's in the law and order domain, whether it's in the economic domain, immutable law is so valuable because it constitutes the parameters which you then plan and execute your action around, right? And again, if they're always shifting and changing, then your planning and execution is way, way, way harder, requires way more resources, is way more depletive to you. But if you can have faith in them, then it's way easier to chart a course and to stay on it. And so, I totally agree with your characterization. I'm wondering though, what do you think will be the effects of bringing an immutable law effectively to the realm of money, the human economic realm? And obviously we have to recognize that money and economics are not just like nice little areas of human study, but they're fundamental to human life, human interaction, and even consciousness, because we get our cues from culture. We get our cues from price signals. We orient our own value hierarchies around the signals that we get from our environment. And all of those things are affected by prices, money, economics, exchange, et cetera. So, this field is far more than just an academic study of numbers in a textbook. Like some people might say, well, economics and money don't interest me. Well, you may not be interested in economics and money, but economics and money is interested in you, right?
Yeah. It's like, Ayn Rand said that you can choose to ignore reality, but you can't ignore the consequences of reality. So it's all around you. What I like to look at is just, so every 250 years, there's this revolution pushing back on centralization and moving to decentralization. And today, there's a 50-year technological revolution cycle that's giving us exactly what the world is asking for at the exact right time. So anybody that thinks that cryptocurrencies or Bitcoin is a fad and is going to go away obviously isn't paying attention, because these move in 50-year cycles and it's giving us exactly what we need right now. Now, another thing that I would say is chasing these things down into the future. Now, first off, humans are horrible at predicting the future. All we can do is imagine a better version of what we have today. We have cars, well, flying cars. Like, that's it. We can't imagine new things that we don't have the building blocks for. So
right.
I'm old enough to have started my early investing career, investing into these weird things that nobody knew anything about. They were called these internet stocks in the late 90s. In 1995 or 1997, we'd talk about the internet and go, it's kind of like a way to send electronic messages. And we have these like chat rooms that we can go chat. And we had this vision that maybe one day we would buy and sell stuff online. We weren't able to do it, but we thought, oh, one day we'll have that, right? We had no idea that our car would be hooked to something called a cloud, using something called like social media to like navigate us around traffic. We didn't know that. And so when we have this technology that's giving us these building blocks, these base building blocks for exactly what we need. Where does that go? The one thing that I would like to say about that is it's way bigger than you and I even know at this point. So I get it, John. It's like digital gold. Sure. Oh, I get it. It's kind of like digital cash. Okay. No. I believe that what we consider money, which you and I talk about extensively, or wealth or value, the definition will be forever changed. So for example, pre-internet days, and so when I was trading that internet boom, we didn't have phones with apps. There was no E-Trade on the computer. At the time, you had to call the stupid broker to place the trade. It was crazy. But before that time, before the internet, what was information? What did people think information was? Well, there was 3 nightly news channels, and there was 1 or 2 newspapers around the country. That was what the information was. Today, a kid in Bali could post a picture on Instagram at the beach, and I know what the waves are like. I know what the beach is like. I know what the scenery looks like. He's created information that's all around me all the time, and I got so much information by him putting that one picture up. So the way that we got it before was either the morning newspaper or nightly news. Today, a kid posting a picture somewhere, or today, we're seeing the mainstream media won't put pictures of the protests going around the world, but we're seeing them on social media. So even information has changed. I think that even what we consider money and value changes. So for example, back to Bitcoin, yeah, it's like digital cash. Sure, it's like digital gold. Some people say it's like a commodity. Maybe it's none of those things. It's code. It's just code, right? And so it's like, I think the way that we even look at wealth and value could be forever changed in that code. It's hard. It's hard to imagine what that means in 10 or 20 years from now, just like it was hard to imagine that electricity was going to allow us to do this one day. But I think it could forever change that relationship or the way that we look at it. And in addition, what I'm also really starting to see, and I'm super bullish on, I was at the BitBlock Boom event in Dallas, I think now about 2 weeks ago, and they had a hackathon going on before that. And we have layers. So technology scales and layers is something to understand with technologically revolution cycles, is that they all work about the same. So if we go back to the automobile boom for a minute, the first automobile came out, everyone got super excited. Venture capital rushed in, the bankers came in. Very quickly, there was 250 automobile manufacturers. Problem was there was no market. No, there wasn't people to buy them, and there was no infrastructure. There was no roads, there was no service centers, gas stations, none of that. So those 250 automobile manufacturers went bust. 3 emerged: Ford, Chrysler, GM. We saw the same thing in the internet, right? So by 1990. The internet went live in the 80s. 1990, the first www went live. 1994, interesting enough, the very first online purchase happened in 1994. And guess what it was for? Do you know? Pizza.
Really?
It was for pizza. But 1995 was the first IPO, Netscape IPO. And that brought the mad rush of venture capital money. And by the year 2000, you had every .com in the world, pets.com with a famous one, webvan.com. But the same problem was there. No market. There was nobody to buy that stuff online. 2, the infrastructure wasn't there. The internet was too slow. You couldn't even buy anything online in 2000. So guess what happened? They all went bust. Now, eventually, the technology scaled in layers. We started adding layers on top of the TCP/IP, and we got the speed and we got everything we need. If we look at this technological revolution of Bitcoin in the same lens, we saw the same thing. The ICO boom brought all the money in. Very quickly, we scaled to 8,000 projects, managing lettuce on the supply chain, logistics, and who knows what. Just like the webvan.com and the pets.com. But the problem is the same. There was no market. Nobody's using it. And there's no infrastructure. Same thing. But today we're seeing it, just like those other cycles, we're seeing it all converge, and now it's all being built. So Bitcoin has layer 2, It's faster, cheaper, and more private than the 8,000 coins. So what's the need for that? Now we have smart contracts, DLC. So what's the point of all the smart contracts? Anyway, at this hackathon, someone designed a phone that works on the Bitcoin network. Wait, I thought Bitcoin was only digital gold. I didn't know I could have censorship resistant phone calls over it. What the heck? Now there's multiple communities. Now, as a content creator, you and I, we could post our podcasts in there, and our community could chat between us, but built on Bitcoin, not just like on Telegram or WhatsApp. It's going through the Telegram servers. They could censor that. Now it's going across the Bitcoin network, peer to peer. What? Now, just like, again, I'm old enough to remember having like 1,000 DVDs on my wall and 1,000 CDs. Today, I don't have any DVDs or CDs. Maybe they're in a box somewhere in storage. I don't have them because I stream it all. Look how much streaming has changed. And so in those community platforms, not only can people download or stream my content, they can stream money to me at the same time. And so we're seeing this change really fast. And again, bringing us all these tools that we need at the exact time we need them.
Yeah, very well put. And I think, again, speaks to the value and potential of an immutable trust layer, right? A method of sending information and determine it and being able to establish via consensus the proper chronology for that information. And what applications does that have? What services benefit? What human actions benefit from that as a base layer? And I think, to your point, what we're going to discover is it's a hell of a lot more than a digital gold. It's a hell of a lot more than, well, I think our definition of money will greatly expand, like you said, right? So right. I was going to say it's a hell of a lot more than money, but maybe it's more proper to say what we think of as money is going to be a hell of a lot more than what it is right now.
Yeah.
We talked a second ago about, I asked you about talent and competency and wealth tends to concentrate. And you said, yes. And this is part of the critique of capitalism. And I'm obviously totally in your court, where I don't think the response to that should be, okay, let's try a completely different system where we forcefully reallocate resources to try to ameliorate this situation. Like you said, first of all, you can be right now, but 10 years from now, you can be wrong, because you develop a solution, you develop a market, you get comfortable in that. And if you're not on your toes, if you don't adapt, if you don't disrupt yourself, then there's a lot of churn at the top. There's a lot of creative destruction. As we said, Apple Computer was started in a garage, right?
Yeah.
And unseated the incumbent IBM. And, what's going to unseat the behemoth Apple? And, because when you get to a certain scale, you're not as laser focused on the next emerging thing. Some companies are more able to stay up there longer, but this churn happens. What the problem is that again, back to this idea that people often have such a simplistic and narrow view of things in a governance structure like the one we have, and fundamentally enabled by a mechanism for involuntarily allocating the wealth of those people, i.e. having a money printer, that gives the governance structure an ability to respond to that overly simplistic thinking by those people and say, okay, you're right. You've been disenfranchised by, someone competing better than you. So we're going to take from them and give to you, right? And among other things, what Bitcoin does is it, more so than ever before, it sanctifies the sovereignty of the individual, right? It makes it so you can keep your wealth, you can store your wealth in a manner by which it's not available for reallocation by whatever entity, the state or whoever controls the money printer or whoever controls the levers of society. It's no longer available to them. That means that intervention by a supermarket actor to say, hey, something unfair has gone on here, we're gonna make it right, quote unquote, is less and less possible. So I guess the question I'm trying to get at is, like, how do you think that circumstance influences how these cycles that we've been discussing of growth, concentration, successful competition, and then disintegration into something else. And for the record, like when I say the disintegration may not be, is not strictly from, let's say individual to collectivist, capitalist to socialist. I mean, the disintegration could be a big company competes well for a while, and then for whatever reason, it stops competing well, it gets disrupted, and it kind of disintegrates, right? But how does that fundamental shift in people's ability to preserve the value of their stored work, labor, capital, energy change the nature of how these cycles of, let's say, individual focus to collective focus play out? Because it would seem to, I think, most people's minds that, well, if you put more power in the hands of the individual, if you make it so it's impossible effectively to steal and reallocate their wealth, well, what happens then?
Yeah. I mean, that point right there is the key, right? So I think anybody could understand that long-term planning is always better than short-term planning, right? So like, if I have a long-term goal, if I can save and I can build and I can scale long-term, it's going to be better than if I think hand to mouth. Like, if you look at society, on the lowest end of society, you have the homeless guy that's probably a drug addict, and he's only thinking to the next hit. That's all he can only see that far. As you move up, you have people living paycheck to paycheck, and then some people are living month to month, and then on the other end, you have people who are planning for multiple generations after them, right? And so if you think about that long-term perspective, everything good comes from long-term perspective. But if I can't live in a way where I can have long-term perspective, what does that do to me? So if I don't know what the laws are going to be next month, for example, which is an actual real scenario that we're in right now, this very second, that's a problem. But also, to kind of what your point, and these two work together, it's the incentive structure. So if I use an extreme analogy, it would be over in Africa, in the Congo, for example, and you have some warlord, and he just comes and steals all the wealth from all the people there whenever he feels like it. And he builds this palace and these mansions, right? So there's two dynamics there. So the villagers, they know that at any moment, they're going to get all their wealth stolen from them. So they're not motivated to build and save and store for the long term, because they know it's going to be taken any moment. And then that puts them into the situation where every day they have to earn enough to live, so they can't ever get ahead and work on higher value tasks. The warlord, he knows that he can go steal wealth whenever he wants. So he's just incentivized to not do anything but just go steal. If we go into a system that changes that, so now we have a decentralized system like Bitcoin, where now those villagers can store their wealth in Bitcoin, and in something that can't be stolen or seized or taken, well, now that changes the power balance. It changes the incentive structure. So now they can save. So now they can start to plan long-term. And it doesn't change things. It's not magic. It's not a magic wand, but over time, over generations, it changes that. But also the warlord realizes, well, shoot, I can't just come steal their wealth. Now I have to provide value to them. That's the key. I have to provide value to them in order to get that back. So that's an extreme example of a warlord, but it's no different in the United States or Canada either, where the United States is incentivized to do whatever they want. Not only can they tax you as much as they want, and all across, they're now talking about minimum taxes across the world, and the U.S. Under the Biden program is going to increase taxes big time next year. Not only can they increase taxes as much as they want, they can also steal your wealth through inflation silently. And so they're not incentivized to treat you with any form of legitimacy or respect, right? You're just a cash cow that's stuck in a pen, right? And this kind of talks about the sovereign individual. But what about when that cow grows wings? And that's what Bitcoin has done, right? So Bitcoin now changes that incentive structure where the state can't just inflate away our wealth. They can't steal our wealth through inflation. They can't even steal our wealth through taxation unless we voluntarily decide to give it to them. And that is what changes that power balance structure, where then the governments are going to have to think back on this and go, shoot, if we don't provide a valuable service to these people, why would they continue to give us money? How else would we get money? And that's a big shift.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, some of the themes from the sovereign individual, right? How the returns on violence are changed when wealth isn't so easily stolen or confiscated, right? And so jurisdictions will have to compete and actually compete for people. Because if you're mobile, if you can take your income and your wealth anywhere in the world you want to, well, all of a sudden it's an open market, baby. Like who wants Mark Moss, right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe Puerto Rico does, maybe El Salvador
Yeah.
does, and they can offer services to attract you. And that's great. One of the questions that I have about that though is we're in a world today where so much power has concentrated into the hands of these national governments. And, let's say a representation of that is just the enormous military capability of many countries, but especially the world powers, right? Nuclear weapons, massive armies, fighter jets, aircraft carriers, all the rest of it. In an environment like the one you described, two questions. How do you think the monopoly on violence changes the ownership of it, what happens to it generally? And is there still a need for an authority that grants property rights outside of, let's say, the digital domain that can be managed via something like Bitcoin, right? So like meat space, right? A piece of land. Who and how is the property and the authority to designate ownership of that property managed in an environment where people's wealth is in an environment where the savings and capital dynamics change in the way that we expect Bitcoin to change them?
That's a very good question. And so that now we're kind of future casting. If I might table that question, only because I think we need to understand the third cycle that's converging right now. Because we're talking about the future and how does that shake out, but we're still talking about the nation state. Or you ask kind of what system would we have, but I think we kind of have to understand, I think the third cycle that's converging right now, which is the financial revolution cycle. And so the power right now is consolidated by these giant nation states because they have the power of the financial system. They have the money printer. Mm-hmm. And so then it's like, well, how can we do anything against them? Because they're these military powers, as you say, with the nukes and all the money and et cetera. And so we have to understand that. And so what I would say is that politically, socially, culturally, we're ready to reject globalism. Now we have a brand new technology that gives us that decentralization that we need. And we also know that technology revolutions lead financial revolutions, so cycles. So financial revolution cycles work on about an 80-year time frame. And we can see 80 years ago was the Bretton Woods Agreement, which was when the whole world got onto a one world money system, right? The dollar was backed by gold. The rest of the currencies pegged to the dollar. Today, 80 years later, the IMF came out and said, we're calling for a Bretton Woods 2. Okay, so that's another new world money system. Of course, we have Mark Carney, who is head of the Bank of England, Bank of Canada, envoy to the UN, the World Economic Forum, saying the same thing, right? We need a great reset. Klaus Schwab wrote the book, we need a great reset of capitalism. Everyone's talking about building back better. So we can see the financial system's ready to be reset. And it's not just that. It moves on a bunch of different cycles. So one, back to natural law. And so everything's kind of being created by credit. So we have these credit cycles and they work on about an 80-year time frame. And as credit expands, things grow really fast. If I have to work to save up to buy a house, it takes me a long time to work to save up that house. But if I can get a loan for 5 houses, I can go buy 5 houses, right? So things grow really fast, but it also, just as fast as it levers up, it also levers back down. And we're kind of at that tipping point where the world's now under about $300-400 trillion of debt. And it's teetering. I mean, the world is trying to crash. It's trying to break down. But the central banks are determined to keep them inflated no matter what. And they're going to keep pumping in trillions. And so it's like this battle. But we know we're at the end of that cycle, which is why they're calling for this great reset. They're calling for a Bretton Woods 2 moment. And we can dig into that financial stuff if you want, but what I would just say is that what I'm seeing is that everybody sees this financial system is crashing. Everybody knows it. They're talking about it. Mainstream media is talking about it. It's not a big unknown. But what is unknown is a lot of people want to know what's next. Does the dollar lose its reserve status? Or does the dollar remain the reserve currency? Will it be a Chinese yuan? Will it be a gold-backed yuan and maybe a central bank digital currency? Will it be like the IMF creates an SDR basket out of central bank digital currency? Will we go back to a gold standard? I mean, you hear all these theories. Everyone's talking about it. But I think what they're missing is that everybody's looking for a centralized answer, right? Who will declare what the next world money is? But if we look at the other two cycles, the revolution cycle, we realize that the world rejects centralization to goes to decentralization. And we have the technology to give us that right now. And so to me, the answer is we don't have a centralized answer for a store of value or money. We have a decentralized answer, whereas Bitcoin is my reserve, it's your reserve, it's MicroStrategy reserve, and now it's El Salvador's reserve. But some people will still be on gold and some people will still be on dollars.
Yep, totally agree. But I still would love to get your opinion on. So let's assume.
Yeah.
Well, let's assume that yes, there's going to be CBDCs and there's going to be Bretton Woods too, and all the incumbent powers are going to try all these ridiculous measures to develop a centralized solution and impose it on people. But more and more people over time will opt into Bitcoin, and whenever in the end game or the punchline is hyper Bitcoinization. Is that 10 years? Is that 20 years? 30 years? 50 years? Who knows, right? But let's just assume that. What is the role of the authority of force in the world after that time?
So I am not, first of all, I think it happens this decade. So I think that by people adopting Bitcoin, we're basically taking away the power that the government has. So the government, yes, has a monopoly on force and violence, to your point, the military, but a military without money is worthless, right? That's how the Roman Empire fell. They expanded so far they couldn't afford to pay the soldiers anymore. I mean, Venezuela had an army, didn't do them any good either, right? So military takes money. So really, yeah, they have the force, but it's the money is their power. And so by defunding them, we take away their power. Now, I think that, like I said, I think that happens this decade. What I'm calling for like the end of the nation state. I think we see the end of this giant nation state, which I believe is old technology, creative destruction. We don't need that technology anymore. Now we have new technology. To answer your question, what does that look like? I think that, and again, I don't know about these labels. I don't know if I fully agree with like anarchist type anarchist type viewpoint, but I think it looks like it's a much more decentralized and a lot smaller. So kind of like the United States used to be 50 independent nations, 50 independent states. I think it would probably be even smaller than that. Some areas might be bigger, some areas might be smaller, but maybe it's city size, where we have cities that are kind of run a little bit privately, no different than a homeowners association. So I used to live in a gated neighborhood. It was a homeowners association, and there was a governing body of that association, and they decided what the houses had to conform to and what you could and couldn't do in the street and things like that. And I think we'll see that type of a society where we have smaller areas, maybe they're large cities or states, that if I don't like the rules in that neighborhood, which I didn't, I moved to another neighborhood that didn't have those rules. That's why I don't live there anymore. And I think we'd see the same thing. And we are. Obviously, people are leaving California in mass going to Texas. People are leaving New York in mass going to Florida. So I think it looks like that. Like I said, probably smaller. The key piece, and this is what I think actually leads to that breakup and enables it to continue going, is competition. That's what enables it. So Texas and Florida have outcompeted California and New York. Both governors are on the chopping block losing their jobs right now. Right. And it's through competition. So what happens when you kind of already mentioned earlier, if I can, per sovereign individual, leave the country with my wealth. Now, I'm old enough to have friends that I grew up under the Cold War, and the Berlin Wall didn't fall till after I graduated, till I was in high school. But I had friends whose families moved from these oppressive regimes, moved from Afghanistan, Iran. One of my best friends came from South Africa. And when they came, they couldn't bring their real estate. They couldn't carry their gold. They couldn't get their money out of the bank, but they left anyway. They came penniless. But how much does that really affect the nation if they can keep all your wealth? But what if I can take my wealth with me? So if the United States, the Western world wants to clamp down so hard that you're not even now able to run your business or move freely, but another country says, hey, come over here, you can live free and you can start a business. Well, then people with means, unfortunately, not good for the poor people, but some of the people that have the means to do that will go to those areas. And that nation will do better than others. So other nations will say, hey, well, you can come over here too. And more people go there. And eventually those big nations will lose so many people. They'll be forced to, not by force, not with nukes, but they'll be forced to relax their regulations to hope people stay and even come back. Now, I can say this pretty confidently because, again, history. So, for example, we're seeing it in real time and right now in California and New York. But if we go back historically, look at China. So China became like the most common, whatever. I'm not going to go all the way back through history, but China was a very communist country and they had it locked down and their people were very poor. And they were one of the poorest countries in the world. In the 80s, they decided that they needed to introduce a little bit of capitalism. Mao died, Deng took over, and he opened up a little bit of capitalism, some free trade ports, things like that. And just opening up a little bit exploded China to where they're at today. And so my point is, why did they go from a full communist country that they had complete control over to introducing capitalism? Because they had to compete, competition. So I think that's the route that we go. I think we see the smaller nation states, cities, states that allow us to move from one to the next. I think competition will be a big integral part that will keep that system going. And the reason why, let me just say this last piece and we'll dig in. The reason why is that because I can store my wealth in Bitcoin, the state can't steal it through inflation or seizing my bank accounts. Everyone will be forced to compete by providing value. And that is what breaks that cycle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I totally agree. And I think what's likely to happen is that, because we talk about this a lot in the space, but that in an environment where the money loses its value, everything else in that market acquires a monetary premium, right? i.e. inflates. Right. And it becomes more expensive to account for the value being dispersed from the money, right? In an ideal society or an ideal market and an ideal money, and I think that's what Bitcoin is, all the monetary, the full idea and value of money is contained in one particular thing. And that facilitates the proper ordering of everything else and trade and structuring of everything else. What's happening now is the opposite. The money is leaking its value all over the place. And that's why everything from used cars to beef to homes to equities are all adopting this monetary, to land are adopting a monetary premium. I think in a Bitcoin world, when Bitcoin siphons back all that monetary premium, because it is the best store of value, everything in our world becomes way cheaper. And not just way cheaper in the sense that, how when we were growing up, like your parents would say, chocolate bar was 5 cents when I was a kid. And you were like, wow, things were so cheap back then. It's $1 now. We'll tell our kids like chocolate bar was $2, or 2,000 Satoshis when, at this period of time, they're like, what? So chocolate bar is only 2 Satoshis now. That's crazy. And so our era is going to seem so much more expensive, but not only will we rectify that monetary perversion that inflation is causing, but I think because of what Bitcoin represents in the quality of the money that it is, it will also mean that we get to reap the benefits of all the productivity increases that a complex dynamic society produces. The benefits of such aren't being siphoned off by the money creators and the people that have that power. And so our material world or our meat space world becomes less and more and more inexpensive, less and less valuable, let's say, because more of the value is contained in Bitcoin. And so I think, among other things, that means that the contentiousness over assets in the material world will decrease because their relative value will be lower, right? So like the incentive to jack someone for their house or for their land or for their car or whatever will be way lower because most people would be able to afford houses, cars, land, etc. The amount of one's wealth held in those assets will be greatly diminished in relative terms relative to their savings held in Bitcoin. But I still wonder, and I doubt you may not have an answer, but I'd love to hear your speculation. Is a sovereign authority, and it seems like sovereign authority in the material realm of human culture and society is force. Is that required? Yes, jurisdictions will compete, but what if I go to, bumfuck nowhere, current day Wyoming, future day land of the free, nobody owns it, and I say, well, that's a lovely 10 acres of land, I'm going to put my farm there and do my thing. And some authority says, sure, John, I'll sell you that land for 10,000 satoshis. But then someone else comes along and says, well, who gave them the right to sell you that land?
Right.
Was it theirs? Who owned that?
Yeah.
So what do you think is the role, necessity of sovereign authority in the physical realm in a future? Yeah. And just the last thing I'll say before I hand it over to you, I think the prospect of this like anarchist society where everybody protects themselves, everyone has their own money, everyone's 3D printing weapons, like this kind of lawless Wild West notion scares a lot of people. But I actually think it's quite possible that because of the way that the material physical world will be in relative terms devalued against the core savings held in a unconfiscatable way, i.e. Bitcoin, the incentives to violence and the incentives to theft and everything will be so greatly diminished that I think our capability of cooperating peaceably in a quote unquote Wild West sort of scenario will be far greater than we can currently imagine. Like when everyone has far more independence, when there's a lot less dependence on other structures, and as a result, there's a lot less anxiety about one's own security and comfort and safety, I think that puts us in a better situation to cooperate where currently we might think something is too contentious to rely on cooperation to resolve it, right? So I think, as you said, with technology, like we can only predict so far. We can say how cars might improve, or they'll go from cars to flying cars, but we can't talk about their teleportation because it's just not, we don't have that technology right now. So I think the same rule should be applied to how humans can act or interact in the future. But nevertheless, I'd love to get your take on sovereign authority in a Bitcoin world.
Yeah, I guess I have to be conscious of my own bias, as I started out talking about, right? Normalcy bias and whatnot. And so it's hard for me to imagine, something different than what we have now. I would say, one, obviously storing your money in a virtual Bitcoin, whatever, your wealth, your value, whatever you want to call it, is great. But to your point, we're always going to need physical stuff. We're still going to need land. We're still going to need to grow food and need a place to have your family, et cetera. And I do agree with your thesis that there wouldn't be as much need for theft because people would be doing better. So I think if you look at, like WTF happened in 1971, you can see like the incarceration rate took off like crazy after 1971. So because it got much harder for families to live and survive, people to get ahead, then that increases the need to go theft, thieve and rob and steal, whatnot. But at the end of the day, I believe in good and evil, and I believe that there is evil, and I believe that there's always going to be somebody trying to shortcut and thieve and rob and steal, regardless of how easy it is to make money. So I think that's still going to be a problem. I think the role of government is to protect private property rights, and I think we're always going to need somebody to provide that. Back to my gated neighborhood example, we had a gated neighborhood with our own security. And that security would check everybody in and out of the gate, and they would patrol the neighborhood. And so we had our own security, and that the association had rules that would protect our private property, make sure our neighbors didn't infringe on us. If people came in, which happens sometimes, we have a homeless problem in California, the security would deal with that. So I think there's always going to be a need for that. I don't think, for me, and I'm a strong Second Amendment supporter and I got a lot of guns, but I certainly don't think living in like a wild, wild west scenario where people were carrying guns and you had to duel people in the street, like that doesn't sound like a world that I'd want to live in. So I think having that some sort of I don't know if I'd want to use the word sovereign individual, but we'd need, or organization, but I think we'd still need, like I said, these micro cities or states that would have that, you know, responsibility of restoring or keeping the order, keeping private property rights. I think it could be done, through private companies. So just like my gated neighborhood example, while I was there, we changed security companies. So, they wanted to change security companies. Some of the residents didn't want to because we had used the same one for so long. We knew all the guards. They had been there forever. And if we move, we don't have those relationships, and there was cost concerns and whatnot. But we did. And we ended up changing security companies. Now, where some of the anarchists, like Svetsky and I have had conversations, he said there won't be a need to vote anymore. But it's like, well, who's gonna get the bids for the service companies? Who's gonna decide which ones are better, and then who's gonna decide which one we go with? Who's gonna do that work, and then who's gonna choose who that person is? So I think there's always gonna be some form of voting going on. I think we're still gonna need governing bodies that can hire and fire and change security companies. Who's gonna build the roads? I mean, they'll hire people to build the roads, et cetera. So there's always going to need to be people to make those decisions, and there'll always be voting, just in a smaller area that will be heavily driven by competition. So if my area becomes unsafe, or my property is being stolen, or my land gets taken, well, all the rich people will leave that area to go to another area that has stronger private property rights. That area will suffer because of that. And I think that competition loop kind of keeps everybody honest.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable that this will play out in various different ways as a process over the course of several decades, right? Before we ultimately figure out again, like who and what is the sovereign exception, right? Who decide, what does authority look like in a Bitcoin denominated world? I guess that's the crux of the question, right? What does authority look like in a hyper Bitcoinized world? That's super interesting to me.
I think, just knowing us as humans, we're social creatures, right? And so we want to live in tribes. Like, it's been that way forever. And so we want to live in tribes, and then we have hierarchies, and nature builds hierarchies, right? And so people develop hierarchies for different things. I just think as much as society today wants to tell you that stuff's old and is irrelevant, it's not. And I think we'll still continue to keep those social agreements as tribes, and we'll still develop those hierarchies.
Yeah, I think I agree. And I think it's really, really, I talk about on this show a lot, like the personal transformations that people experience, many people, as a result of learning about and engaging with Bitcoin. And I think we're on the precipice of an equally transformative revolution from that perspective and that side of things with people. And, again, when I use the word Wild West, and the first image that comes to your mind is like people dueling, carrying around guns and all this kind of stuff, that's natural, right? Because that's the image we have of it. But in the manner I was thinking of it was in terms of everyone having such a high degree of independence and control over their own lives' determination, right? A higher degree than ever of self-determination. And as a result of that, a higher degree than ever of personal responsibility, and as a result of that, a higher degree than ever of personal and interpersonal understanding. And as a result of that, a higher degree than ever of individual philosophy and broader philosophy. And so, again, I'm people will call me, to say that I'm being a little bit too utopian here, but, it's fun to speculate, right? And I think when, again, like, yes, I agree, the world will be on a Bitcoin standard in roughly 10 years, let's say. When will the genuine renaissance happen where these individual transformations take place to such an extent that we wind up living in a society in which people interact in a totally fundamentally different way? Yes, still competence hierarchies and dominance hierarchies of various kinds, but far more able to, for lack of a better, more specific term, interact with so much dependence and such a high degree of autonomy. So yes, I maybe I have the capability to contradict you or get in conflict with you. But how we end up resolving those conflicts is completely different than how we conceptualize them today. So people may have the same degree of autonomy of a Wild West, or actually far more, but the behavior that results from that autonomy is not what we would consider Wild West behavior of 200 years ago or whenever it was, you know?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of, I would agree with a lot of that. I could see how we might go from, and I haven't really thought a lot about this, but say that 30 to 40% of society today is really trying to make themselves better, their careers better. Maybe that moves from 30% to 80 or 80%. But I think there's always going to be people in society that are evil. And I think there's always going to be people in society that are lazy and aren't going to want to better themselves. There's always going to be people that want to take the shortcut. I would agree that that number goes from 70 to 20%. But I think those people are always going to be there. And then you're also going to have the situation where, again, because men are evil and want shortcuts, that power that they get will start to corrupt them. And then they're going to want to try to, take private property and whatnot. So I think, I don't think the problem ever goes away. To your point, like your utopian society view, I don't think that ever goes away. Maybe I do agree it could definitely minimize. Having the money can fix a lot of that. But I think at the end of the day, someone's always going to need to enforce those rules.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I wonder what kind of social enforcement will look like when, 90 out of 100 people are these sovereign, principled people. And because, what we see on Twitter these days, I mean, of course, it's brash and it's crazy. And I mean, this is the beginning stages of something really unique coalescing. So we can't infer too much about it at these early stages, but there is clearly a holding of people to a higher set of principles than out in the broader world, right? And so again, fast forward 50 to 100 years on that, and how much of a social constraint does, and I mean a positive one, right, to constrain, let's say, the evil members of society, that the majority is so intent on enforcing certain principles and values, and how much does that diminish the ability of that evil to express itself, right? Obviously, I'm just speculating, but it's interesting questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think, as I think in the beginning, we talked about, everything good comes from that long-term perspective. And so you have that hierarchy of needs. And so in my extreme example of the Congo, when people are forced every day to go out and find sustenance just to live that day, they can't think about longer term things. And that's an extreme example, but, in the 40s and 50s, you could have one person in the family working, and you had a family unit because of that. And, the social fabric of the world or the country was better. Whereas today, it used to take 23 weeks. Now it takes 53 weeks to have the American dream, but there's only 52 weeks in a year. So people can't even have the American dream. They're racking up debt. Divorce is the number one cause of divorce is finance problems. You have the incarceration rate. And so the lack of being able to provide, or having to work 80 hours to provide, breaks down that social fabric, and causes all types of problems. So I definitely agree with you on that. I think when people don't have to work as much, they can pursue other things, make themselves better, personal development, helping other people, even just being in the community more, et cetera. So it definitely goes, like I said, I don't know, 30% to 80%. But yeah, still somewhat of a problem there.
Yeah. I know you got to bail soon, so I got two more for you. But on just to put a capstone on that point, we on this point in particular, and we talked about these recurring cycles, right? Broadly characterized as like people becoming complacent by how good things are, and then things deteriorating and requiring, a regrouping and to build them back up again. Many, not all, but a vast majority of ancient cultures, and particularly the most successful cultures in our human story, they used ritual very liberally. And I think one of the functions of ritual is actually to try to communicate and instill and remind and enforce the importance of certain things, be they philosophies, practices, ideas, principles, values, etc. And in an environment we're moving into where the way that we generate social cohesion, cooperation, success is not so much the all-powerful state saying, do this, don't do that, do this, don't do that. It's we have a lot more freedom and autonomy, right? But recognizing that it may very well be the case that no matter how much technology liberates the individual, this cycle of creating such good times that we forget what created them and then we slip back into bad times, it might be inevitable, right? It might be unavoidable. And this is why I think as we move into the Bitcoin era, I think we're going to see a pretty, very interesting, but possibly dramatic revival of ritual. And obviously they haven't really been developed yet, although I bet if we look hard enough, we could see seedlings of them. But to as a recognition that, okay, things are going to be really good. We've put the constituent parts together that things are going to be really good at after a transitionary phase. We realize the danger of things being good. Okay, what are the fundamental things that we believe as a culture, individuals, a society, that are the most important to remind ourselves of intermittently, so that the very things that make everything good can be preserved and held up as best or as long as possible. And so again, I don't have any idea what those are going to be, but I do think we'll recognize that need, and ritual will reemerge as a because we just live our lives. We wake up, it's Christmas, it's Easter, it's Halloween, and it's our birthday, and that's the extent of our ritual. I think we'll have far richer rituals become a major part of our life as a result of recognition of this circumstance.
I would agree with you that they're absolutely necessary. Back to 1984, the book, written in the 40s, he talks about how they destroyed all of history, right? They wanted to get rid of the past. They didn't want you to know about the past. And one of the things that they really don't want is they don't want you to think back on the past fondly. Like, if we could just go back to the way it was. And so today we can see they've done just that. They've ripped down the statues. They're destroying the books. They've recharacterized the founding fathers of the United States as horrible people and horrible times, because they don't want us to think fondly of the past. And so they've changed that. Now back to the rituals, there's another big lie that we're being told today, which is that we identify based off of sexual preference or gender or race or things like that, which is a lie. We align on values. And the higher those values, the more alignment we have. And so the United States used to have a set of values that immigrants from all over the world would come to the United States because of the values that were present, like the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And so what happened, though, is we started bringing, simultaneously, the U.S. started kind of rejecting those values, breaking down those values, and we started bringing a lot of immigrants in that don't share those values. So instead of wanting to come and be an American, now they want to come be whatever, and you see these Vietnamese communities or Muslim communities or whatever. They don't want to assimilate in. And so it's broken down these values. And so the values are important. And then to your point, like these rituals, so growing up as a kid, we would stand up and we would pledge allegiance to the flag, right? And that would be an example of that. Today, they don't even want to do that anymore. They don't want to communicate what those values are. And I think that even goes bigger. So I read a book about passing legacy on down to your kids and your grandkids. And even in that book, they talked about how it's important to sit down at the table with your kids and talk about our family was this, our family did this. This is what our family is. You're this way because you're from this family. And it's important to do that. This book was talking about the importance to do that with your family, to pass that down. But to your point, it's important as a country to have those shared values and then have some sort of a ritual or something to continue to pass those down. So I would say I would agree with you, because it's probably the only way it can work. Everyone has to buy in.
Yeah, exactly. All right, last one, man. And kind of circling way back to how this started and my attempts at communicating with people in my life. this is all, we're very optimistic about the mid to long term future, right? But I think we both realize just how ingrained and ultimately how dependent people are on the systems as they are today. And because of that, as those systems break down, well, then people who are reliant and dependent on it are going to suffer the consequences of that breakdown. And so, what do you see as the next 5 to 10 years? What does it look like? And, if you're your average person, you got your retirement fund, you got your index funds, you got your financial advisor and all this stuff, like, given what's on the horizon, what would be your recommendation for how to prepare? Not financial advice, all disclosures, blah, blah, blah.
So this is probably where we should have started. So maybe in editing, you'll move this to the front. But what's the urgency, right? What's the urgency? What's really at stake here? Now, I've laid out the case of 3 different cycles at 3 different lengths that are all converging right now. But I don't think I've fully conveyed what's really at stake here. And so while, as I've made the case, throughout history, it's just a constant repeating of cycles from oppression to revolution. I believe that cycle that's been going on from all of humanity potentially ends this decade. That cycle is broken and it doesn't continue to repeat anymore. And the reason why I say that is because of technology. Now, technology is a tool, but it can be used as good and bad. And unfortunately, much of the good technology that I've always wanted is now being weaponized and used against us. And so things that make us better, I grew up watching the Jetsons as I was a kid, and I dreamed of being able to talk to my house and have it do things. But now I'm afraid to have Amazon Alexa because it's going to spy on me, right? So we have this technology, but it entraps us. And so what we've already seen, it's already been admitted by the likes of Facebook, using their AI, they're manipulating people's feeds to get them to think certain ways. Now, we have extreme censorship that's censoring what people are saying and sharing online. I tried to send somebody an article yesterday, a DM on Twitter, and it blocked it to them. And it said, do you know this person? And they had to accept it before they could receive the link that I sent them. One of my friends that I go with all the time. So anyway, they can manipulate our feed. They can censor us. And I think, with the social credit score system that they're trying to implement across the world right now, where you even say anything wrong and next thing you know, you can't fly. I mean, you and I, we're hardcore liberty lovers, and we're already censoring what we say. I've noticed it a couple of times on this show. And so what I believe is that we're basically at a battle for the rest of humanity at this point, where either technology creates this perfect prison that we may never get out of, because revolutions start by a few people getting together and sharing ideas, and then the information grows, and then eventually enough people can coordinate that they act, right? But what happens if we can't ever get together and share ideas? What happens if we don't have any way to communicate and coordinate? They could effectively make sure that revolutions never happen ever again, which is, of course, exactly what they're trying to do. The main goal of the state is to keep its power. And in order to do that, they have to keep any civil disobedience at bay. And so I believe with technology, we're almost there. We're almost there. Of course, Klaus Schwab of the World Economic Forum wrote a book called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. In that book, he outlines this whole process, transhumanism, and basically put chips in our brain to hook to this AI cloud. That's their goal for us. And so technology is almost there. That creates this perfect prison. So the cycle ends and we just end up in slavery for all of humanity. But we have another technology that's our tool. And it's our tool to fight back. And that's Bitcoin. That's decentralized technology. So we can defund the state. We can take their money away. 2, we can move everything on decentralized platforms that they can't control. And I believe that we win. And if we win here, I believe that we also break the cycle. Because the cycle is always man manipulating, changing rules, using force, and with the money printer. And if we take that away, we could also break the cycle for the rest of humanity. So I believe that the battle for and I know this is a big claim,
but the soul of humanity,
the battle for the fate of humanity is in this battle right here. And either my kids and my grandkids are going to live the rest of their life as, basically in a matrix type,
Odds.
prison, or my kids and grandkids and great grandkids will live a life of freedom. And I believe that battle is going to be won or lost over this decade, probably over the next 4 or 5 years. Now, that doesn't mean that we still won't have recessions, and I mean we're always going to have ebbs and flows. That's just how life works. We have seasons. There's no way around that. But we'll either be stuck in the slave system, the matrix, or we'll be without it. And that's the urgency. And so, for anybody that is debating where they're at in this fight, just ask yourself, like, the world is trending to totalitarianism at a rapid rate, at a very rapid rate. Are you okay with it today? Are you okay with where it's going? Are you okay with where it will be when your kids are, older? And if the answer is no, then you have no chance. You have no choice but to join in this fight. You have no choice but to use the only one tool that we have to fight back right now. That's the urgency.
Yeah,
now, there's financial urgencies we can get into too, but I don't know if they're quite as powerful as that.
You mean the opportunity?
Well, I mean, right? In addition, I mean, so if we want to talk about,
please do, because to be honest, you may be right, you may be wrong about whether this is the ultimate battle of this particular cycle, but even still, like when you say we're sliding into totalitarianism like at a rapid rate, obviously I couldn't agree more. Most people don't see it, right? But hitting people in their pocketbooks, everyone's sensitive to that. And This is why I kind of opened it by saying, like, look, the Venezuelan stock market has done great over the last decade. Yeah. Would you want to be invested there? No, right. Because you have to be careful of your denominator, right? They're denominating equities in the bolivar or whatever the currency they're pushing on people. We're denominating in Canada and the Canadian dollar, you guys in the US dollar. That's almost like a spell to trick you that things are okay or that things are going well. You need to recognize that they're not, right? And the signals that you're relying on to get your impression about how things are going are almost all false. Yeah. Right. So you need to consider that, and then realize that Bitcoin is not some hot investment to get rich quick. It's a way to make sure that you're receiving proper signal and you're protecting yourself against the chaos.
Yeah. So that's a great point. So if we understand that money is communication, it communicates between us. And really, to your point, as you said, it's the signal price. The price is the signal. And so what happens is when the Fed prints $8 trillion over the last year and a half and dumps that into the economy, then the signal gets distorted. So for example, when the signal is distorted, how can we make good decisions? So for example, homes in the United States have never been higher. They're at all-time highs. Should I buy a house now or not? That's a big decision I need to make. How can I make that decision when the signal is distorted? So let me give you an example. In US dollars, homes have never been more expensive. But if I priced the homes in gold, what does it tell me? Well, if we go to 1971 is when we broke the standard, right? So 1970, the year before, it was about 650 ounces of gold to buy the median home. Today it's 200. So homes have never been more expensive in US dollars, but they're less than half the price in gold. Okay, that's just gold. What about oil? Okay, it used to be 6,000 barrels of oil. Now it's about 2,000 barrels of oil. Well, priced in oil, it's cheaper. Okay, those are commodities. What about food? Well, rice. It used to be 47,000 tons of rice. Today it's 24,000 tons of rice. In 2010, it was who knows how many Bitcoin. Today it's only like 2 or 3. So it's like the price being the signal so distorted. Are homes expensive or cheap? Compared to what? Relative to what? Priced in what? Priced in dollars that are distorted. Yeah, they've never been more expensive, but priced in real world assets, they're actually way cheaper. So that's one way to look at it. And I think there's like this paradigm shift, which most people are seeing, but they just haven't quite made the paradigm shift, is that it's really all about purchasing power. So for example, just like that example, right? Where the US dollar doesn't purchase as much, but other stuff does. And so I guess what I would say is, like, people realize this right now. Here's kind of the urgency. Everybody realizes, like, shoot, I better go buy a house right now because Next year, they're going to be so much more expensive. I better go buy a used car right now because it's going to be so much more expensive. I better go buy lumber right now or food right now because it's going to be so much more expensive in the future. What they're seeing and what they're saying to themselves, they're just not quite realizing it. Let me switch this.
Your camera go?
It should come back on. What they're saying to themselves is not that things are getting so expensive. What they're realizing is that their dollar is dropping in value so fast. And it's just a little paradigm shift. But I think if they grasp that, that's the first thing. The other thing that I would say is that the Federal Reserve, the central banks increased the money supply by 24% last year, the money supply. So when you have more money chasing the same amount of goods and services, prices naturally go up on those. Well, now we have supply chain issues. So the goods and services are actually dropping. So the money's going up while the goods and services are going down. And so we see price inflation happening everywhere. So the money supply went up by 24%. Real estate went up exactly 24%. Used cars went up 30%. Lumber went up 300%. So prices are going all over the place. Now, the government's number will tell you it's going up by 5.5%. But even if you take that number, which of course isn't true, even at that number, that means in 4 years, you're going to lose 25% of your purchasing power. 25% of your wealth will be gone in 4 years. Like, I'm not okay with that. That's a third number. The reality is it was 24% in the last year. You've lost 25% of your wealth in the last year. If you were going to buy a home, you buy 25% less home. That's 25% in a year. That means over 4 years, you've lost well over half your purchasing power. Oh, half of your money is gone in 4 years if you're holding dollars. If you're buying assets like real estate that are paying you in dollars. Now, the question you have to ask yourself is, will the government continue on this path of printing money, or will they turn around and have austerity and go back on a budget? And I think if you understand a little bit about what's going on, you realize pretty quickly that they're going to continue spending. I mean, they're already talking about another $3.5 trillion bill. They haven't even got the last $1.5 trillion through. You look at the entitlements that we have, the aging population, Social Security, Medicare benefits, et cetera. And it's not just the United States, it's all the developed nations. So Europe, the ECB is having the same problems. Canada's having the same problems. Australia's having the same problems. Japan's having the same problems. And so when you understand that, you realize real quickly that in Canada and the United States, they're going to have to continue to print 25% more money each year, if not more. And so that means, as I said, right, and you're losing 25% of your wealth a year in dollars. Can you afford to do that? Now, that might seem extreme, but like in Lebanon, they saw 100% of their wealth gone in a year. In Venezuela, you've mentioned, they saw 2,500% inflation in a year. That means you lost all your wealth in about a month. So at some point, unfortunately, everybody's going to hit their point. The urgency is going to be high enough. I would say you've just lost 25% of your wealth in a year. The urgency should be pretty dang high.
Right. Yeah. Extremely well put. And people, because being in Bitcoin, both of us, I'm sure, get this all the time. People are like, what do you think the price of Bitcoin is going to be in 5 years? Right? People are saying it's going to be 200,000, 500,000, a million. Like, do you think that's going to happen? And I try to get people to reframe it and not like, I don't want you thinking you're going to sell for dollars. I want you to think that your gain is going to be the incremental and likely dramatic increase in the purchasing power of your Bitcoin.
Exactly.
So that Bitcoin functions as a portal to a cheaper world for you. Right. Yes. To a more abundant world. Stop thinking about some sexy investment that's going to make you a few $1,000,000. Think of it as a savings vehicle that increasingly makes your world cheaper and cheaper. And what does that mean? It means you can have more world. You can have more life. That's what it means. And if you think about it in those terms, and recognize that as you say, now it's not really a choice. It's a necessity. Right? Because even if on paper, you're keeping pace with things, one, you're probably not keeping pace as well as you think you are. And two, you're leaving yourself subject to the increasing encroachment of the state apparatus to tax you in various ways, tax you through inflation, tax you directly, inhibit the flows of your money, where you can send it, who you can send it to. All of these measures of control are the noose is tightening, right? And Bitcoin is the complete antithesis of that. It's total freedom in money, and it's access to a more abundant world.
To put a number on that, in 2017, it would take 30,000 Bitcoin to buy the median home. 30,000 Bitcoin. Today, it's about 300.
Sorry, I lost you.
To buy the median home in the United States, it'd be about
2017.
Yeah, when Bitcoin was $1,000 or $2,000. So if Bitcoin was if Bitcoin was $1,000, right, and the median home price was, I mean, by July, August of 2017,
right?
Huh? So I'm sorry, you're right. 300. It'd be about 300 Bitcoin, right? If Bitcoin was $1,000 today, it takes about 30. So homes used to be 300 Bitcoin. Today, homes are 30 Bitcoin.
Right.
Right. So that kind of illustrates your point. They've gotten way cheaper. You can buy way more home today. If you were using Bitcoin as your denominator, it used to be 300. Today, it's 30.
Right. In a couple of years, it'll be 3, and then it'll be 300,000 sats, and then it'll be 30,000 sats. And, that's all indications are pointing to that's the way things are going to continue to go, So, I guess my message to anyone listening is if you've been waiting to make the move, make it, and make it in a big way, because I think it's really the only way to protect yourself against what's coming. Mark,
I have to go to my webcam.
Yeah. Like your camera's cutting out on you, so maybe that's a good, time to put a pin in it. I really appreciate the chat, man. I love your work, love what you're doing, and love how you talk about these concepts, promote the cause of liberty and freedom and responsibility and financial security. I think it's awesome, and I appreciate it very much. Anything you wanted to say before we shut this thing down?
I would just add that, I made a couple of big claims. Like one, I think by the end of the decade, we kind of see the end of the nation state, over the next 4 or 5 years, this battle rages on. And so while I actually have a message of great hope, it's not doom and gloom. I believe, and I think we both agree, that on the other side of this is massive hope and prosperity. It's going to be a much better world, one that I'm excited for my kids to be able to inherit. Unfortunately, from here to there isn't going to be so nice and pretty. And that's why, to the point, you and I are both kind of trying to create that sense of urgency, like take the actions now. And I think a couple of things you need to do. One, just be mentally prepared for that. Two, be prepared to possibly move. It's the competition that's going to break things eventually. And so, having to leave a jurisdiction that doesn't treat you well, go where your money's treated best. I would also encourage people to try to learn some high value skills that can be done remotely, either work remotely online or learn skills that can be done remotely online. High value skills are typically ones that are done around the money. So sales and marketing, you could learn Facebook ads or copywriting or video editing, content creation, article writing, et cetera, things like that. And then ultimately think about things in terms of purchasing power and ways that you can move your wealth into places that will conserve your wealth. Because being able to survive these next 5-6 years with your wealth intact is what's going to be the main ingredient for you being able to live that better life in the future. No different than we've seen countries many times fall in the past, and the people that were able to have that better life in the new world. So those are things that I would encourage. If I may, John, I'm actually having a live event conference in Miami in November with the theme specifically how to survive the coming Great Reset. And we're going to be basically covering all these topics from the political side, the financial side, what's at stake, how to preserve your wealth, how to build additional wealth, how to think about sustainable living onshore, offshore living passports, et cetera. So if this urgency is scary and you want to know exactly what to do to survive it, you may want to consider coming to the live event and meeting other people that also think the same way with some real solutions.
That's awesome, man. How do people get more info about that?
So I don't know if you can link it in the show notes down below.
Sure.
And then if you like these topics, you can just follow me on YouTube, Mark Moss, or I'm pretty active on Twitter, just the #1 Mark Moss as well.
Sweet. Well, man, I'm sure we will discuss these themes many more times over the next few months and years. So I look forward to doing that as our thinking evolves and as the situation evolves. So until then, take care of yourself.
Thanks so much, John.
All right. See you.